So I want to start by saying that this is preliminary research that I'm doing, some thinking that I've been doing about the issue of reissues and how they intersect with other elements in jazz life. And so because it's preliminary, I actually rewrote most of it last night. So I'm happy to be here, a little bit tired, and I want to say that today's presentation, if there are comments that come out of this, discussions and challenges, normally I would be very unhappy about that, but today I'm very happy to get those kinds of challenges. So thank you. So let me start. The 1979 Grammy Award show introduced a new category. Michael Brooks, who produced a reissue compilation, Lester Young Stories Volume 3, the previous year, was given a Grammy Award for Best Historical Repackaged Album. That year, the Grammy Award Committee acknowledged what the record industry had known for a long time, that there's money to be made and knowledge to be gained and shared by marketing classic jazz recordings, even obscure ones, in a new format with perceptive liner notes, and most of all, a reappraisal of, and perhaps a genuflection to, towering figures in jazz history. But the importance of the reissue does not rest with the casual listener alone, or perhaps not even the jazz fan addressed on that Grammy Award night. Over the years, jazz reissues have become a staple in pedagogy for young jazz players. The growth and importance of reissues in the 1970s and ever since has coincided with an explosion of jazz programs in colleges, universities, and conservatories. Until quite recently, these programs focused the bulk, if not all of their attention, on bebop and post-bebop repertoire in the big band format. One of the standard teaching tools in these settings is to have students listen to, transcribe, and reproduce solos as they are captured on vinyl. Even since before the advent of the college jazz program, jazz recordings have held a privileged place in the jazz aspirants' toolkit. Reissues, cleaned of pops and crackles, remastered to make the most of current playback technology, are important resources in this effort. Not only do they provide a text to study and replicate, but they also let this jazz student and fan know which recordings which recordings, and which styles make up the jazz canon. But until well into the 70s, as David Ake points out in a 2002 book, only a few accredited music programs in this country offered students jazz in any form, until the mid-1970s. The vast majority of schools remained staunchly dedicated to providing instruction in the Western classical tradition. Some of the more prestigious conservatories not only omitted the genre, but also actually forbade the playing of jazz in the school's practice rooms, with transgressions possibly leading in extreme cases to the student's expulsion from the institution. Whether you were lucky enough to be in a jazz program during the nascent period of jazz entering the community during the mid-1970s, or studying on your own, jazz reissues were prizes to be collected and used. A reissued, pristinely remastered record could provide a definitive stylistic text and even a corrective for students whose conservatory-trained teachers, to quote Ake again, stressed the same musical concepts valued in other ensembles, centered in stable intonation, correct note reading and placement, section balance, and so on, and not, incidentally, little in the way of improvisation. By the way, the paltry number of course offerings as of the beginning of the 70s would soon spike dramatically, even exponentially, and I'll return to that point later. The Best Historical Repackaged Album that I mentioned before, that award also served another related function. Other jazz category awards for new releases that year tended to reinforce a canon of bebop, post-bebop, and to a lesser degree, swing-based jazz, as they had most of the years that decade. Jazz-centered Grammy Awards had gone to performances by Oscar Peterson, Phil Woods, and Count Basie, with Al Jarreau's R&B-inflected album slightly out of the mainstream there in 1978. Now, in 1979, the initial year for this Best Historical Repackaged Album, Oscar Peterson won again, as did Mel Lewis and Thad Jones this time, The fusionist Al Jarreau won a second year in a row. And Chick Corea, meanwhile, took an award for Just Friends, a return to the acoustic fold for one of the artists most closely identified with fusion jazz. The Grammy's recognition of a venerable reissue, along with this reinforcement of post-bop, acoustic sensibilities in new performances, combined to make a pronouncement about what jazz meant. Perhaps underscoring the purpose of a historical reissues award at that time, it's no secret that the late 70s was generally a moment of deep ambivalence about fusion jazz, which had come to prominence a decade or more earlier, but was seen with sustained wariness among mainstream jazz fans and avant-gardists alike. That ambivalence did not abate as the 70s ushered in the Reagan decade, although the Grammy award-winning body, the Grammy awarding body succeeded in both acknowledging fusion and bracketing it off from jazz proper the following year with the new category jazz, Best Jazz Fusion Performance, Vocal or Instrumental. That year, Weather Report won. Throughout the next decade and beyond, the issues of iconic jazz recordings and the rise of a group of young lions who strove to channel those older recordings' stylistic values combined to instruct the jazz student, the jazz fan, and the culture at large what jazz meant, and it had little to do with plugging in. Today, I'd like to consider style in jazz, pointedly during the late 1970s and the 80s, but also in the years since then. I'm interested because I'm aware of the impact of historical recordings on a concurrent flowering of jazz programs across the country, devoted both to the playing technique and to historical study. I'm also aware that there is a history of complaints lodged against many jazz conservatory settings in which pedagogues are taken to task for raising a generation of students who are extremely well versed in the harmonic, melodic, rhythmic, and formal techniques of jazz improvisation, but somehow have missed out on creating a voice of their own. I'm interested in the relationship between jazz style as taught and played in college programs and the reissues wave that seemed to grow into a tsunami in the mid-1980s when the compact disc became the commodity of choice for the record industry. The first commercial compact disc players were introduced to the U.S. market in 1983. How old are you? Where were you born?
88.
All right. So we've been, for me and for I think Lewis, Lewis is maybe less old than I am. That was an innovation.
Don't tell him.
It was a big change, but for you, it's very, very old technology. So introduced to the U.S. market in 1983, and by 1985, a CD recording had already sold a million copies. That was Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. By 1988, over 400 million CDs had been manufactured in 50 plants worldwide. Newspapers and journals soon began to take note of the CD's impact on the record industry generally, and by 1989 there were several articles assessing the CD's energizing role in the reissues market. Long before that time, though, the reissues business had already taken root, as we've seen, and this market already counted for a large portion of jazz record sales at the beginning of the 80s decade. Despite its linkage to a technological and marketing revolution, the reissue, and soon the CD reissue, coincided with a general conservative nostalgia for an imagined halcyon time, socially, economically, and musically. For many jazz fans, critics, and players, the 1950s to the mid-1960s represented an apotheosis in jazz style, and reissues became a way of reclaiming what they feared had been abandoned through fusion. Beyond this, jazz, by now firmly attaching itself to the college campus and broadly touted as America's classical music, was becoming transformed in its cultural associations. From an image that invoked the Eisenhower era with its complicated mixture of economic stability, alongside international tensions and a growing civil rights crisis, jazz was now actively being embraced, if not co-opted, in the 1980s as Madison Avenue's prime shorthand image for cosmopolitan sophistication. Inevitably, the context of the music's cultural meanings changed in its new time and setting, and I suggest that its musical meanings changed too. These recordings could no longer be understood as capturing a musical moment, but rather as describing its residue, literally an imprint, a record. I'm interested in Jed Vasula's comment that a recording tends to reify improvisation, converting the extemporaneous into scripture. More generally, I want to ask several questions. To what degree did reissues help to regenerate consumers' interest in jazz? Did this trend succeed, and did it in the process expand or suppress the music's vitality? Did the rise of the reissues market expand or close off recording and performance opportunities for young jazz musicians, or indeed for older ones? Did the musical aesthetics these reissues presented reinforce an understanding of their original times, or did they replace their context with new ones? Did the commitment to nostalgic approaches to jazz playing, focused on replicating the sounds, if not the improvisational impulses of their origins, have an effect on jazz performance pedagogy in the new Jazz Academy? And if so, was this positive or deleterious? And have these effects been long-lasting and permanent, or have they also changed? So I've mentioned reissues generally and CD reissues more pointedly. And the advent of the compact disc added tremendous impetus to the reissue phenomenon. But the explosion of high-quality reissues began a few years before the CD seemed poised in 1983 to make vinyl records obsolete. The advent of digital recording in the late 1970s led to advances in remastering technology that opened up reissues as a prestige commodity. In a 1981 profile of Verve's new reissue program, spearheaded by producer David Town, the label was described as embarking on a massive reissues effort. Quality was the point to Verve, driven by advances in digital mastering capability and an advanced vinyl record manufacturing plant in Japan. Town projected a catalog of 800 reissued Verve titles to be launched in the marketplace over the next few years, as well as reissues from subsidiary labels such as Mercury, Emerson, and Philips Jazz. Beyond the possibility of improved quality, Verve calculated that they could sell remastered and repackaged records from their back catalogs on a grand scale. Speaking for the label, Town perceived a phenomenal resurgence of interest in jazz. Pointing to a huge uptick in jazz courses, the article pointed to 800,000 students all over the United States enrolled in some kind of jazz program in colleges today. But colleges today, I mean, just a few years after the time that David Ake is talking about, when jazz was excluded very specifically from music programs. Town saw an untapped market out there for jazz reissues. Another example of reissues marketing comes to mind. Miles Davis's Kind of Blue became a multi-platinum record in 2008. That means 4 million units sold, and has become the biggest selling jazz album of all time. The fact that the album took 49 years to achieve multi-platinum status has been noticed before. I was looking for ways to measure that, and as I recall, Taylor Swift had an album out a year and a half ago that took 3 months to gain that same multi-platinum status. I'm sure that says something. So the fact that it took 49 years to achieve has been noticed before. In fact, it's been noticed by me in an article I wrote. Less explicitly noticed is the means by which this was done. The album has been in a near constant state of reissuance since it was first released in 1959. Besides many reprints during the vinyl era, just running out of goods and reprinting the same goods. There have been some 13 reissues in different formats, from reel-to-reel and cassette tape issues to the 50th anniversary deluxe collector's edition, which actually missed by a year because it came out 49 years after the album's initial release. Kind of Blue is a study in marketing and a key to the reissue's power to continually regenerate fan interest. As one reviewer tells it, I thought I had reached the point of no return with Kind of Blue. Having listened to it so many times, having owned it in so many of its reissued iterations, I suspected, feared even, that I might never desire to hear it again. That is, until the reviewer got the goodies inside. And I couldn't even get the full deluxe box, which includes staggeringly the original album on CD, along with several studio segments, breakdowns and false starts, a second CD that compiles recordings by the Kind of Blue Ensemble from 1958, and a 17-minute, previously unreleased concert version of the lead track So What, recorded in 1960. The new set also includes a riveting 55-minute documentary DVD on the making and impact of Kind of Blue. The set also included, for an extra $100, a 12x12 full-color 60-page book and the LP on 180-gram blue vinyl. The key to generating and regenerating consumer interest lies in keeping the product fresh, quite outside the merits of the music. Further proof of Reissues' influence on the market is in the number of record labels wholly or mostly dedicated to them. There are, at a casual count, 30 such labels of varying size, the most prominent being Mosaic and Legacy, and Rhino Records, although not restricted to jazz, is the industry leader in reissued music, including jazz. And I should also count jazz labels that do traffic in new recordings, but that also devote an immense amount of their efforts to reissues, like Columbia's subsidiary Blue Note Records, as well as the Concord Music Group, which became the largest collection of jazz labels in the industry with the mergers of, in 2004 and 5 of Concord Records with Fantasy and Tillock, and the immense catalogs of Concord's subsidiary labels like Riverside, Milestone, Concord Jazz, and Prestige. One of the key strategies of Mosaic Records' success is to concentrate on high-quality sound remastering, pressings of small quantities, 500 units is typical, and with an emphasis on complete collections of an artist on a particular label or within a particular time frame, according to their website, with extensive essays by noted jazz critics and historians. Mosaic's catalog includes well over 250 such collections, such as the 7-CD set of Buddy Rich's small group recordings, originally on MRC and Verve. Also, the complete 7-CD collection of Verve recordings of guitarist Tal Farlow, and the complete Brunswick parlophone and vocalion sessions of trumpeter Buddy Berrigan. So it's not only the obvious things that they're going for, they're looking for completeness, and they're looking for things that have potential historical value. All right. That give me another question?
Yep.
Okay, so did this trend succeed, and did it in the process expand or suppress the music's vitality? I think it did both. It both succeeded and did not succeed. The trend did succeed in reinvigorating or expanding the careers of several musicians of an earlier generation who were able to get new record deals on the strength of the interest generated by reissues of their earlier material. Or it may simply be that the public's appetite for jazz was growing. Nat Adderley, for example, recorded prolifically as a leader and as a sideman with the Cannonball Adderley Quintet until 1974, shortly before Cannonball died, then continued to record, but exclusively, with small labels that could only offer low distribution until he released a little New York Midtown music in 1978 on the Fantasy label, on the Fantasy subsidiary label, Galaxy. However, others did not find a way to ride the wave of new interest in jazz. George Coleman had been a leading figure in the 1960s, recording as a sideman with Miles Davis and Herbie Hancock, among others, but he recorded only sporadically in the 1970s and released only 2 commercial records as a leader from 1976 through 1988. Of course, the shrinking fortunes generally for post-bebop jazz, as rock and fusion exploded in popularity in the early and mid-1970s, paired with a sharp contraction in overall record production during the 1973 and 74 oil crisis, put additional pressure on musicians who might also be already fragile, at times exacerbating problems that could have been eased with a steady income flow. And one of the people that I think of when I say that statement is James Moody. Beyond the number of recording opportunities for these and many other important players from the hard bop heyday, the small distribution and absence of promotion, especially compared with the crop of young lions emerging in the 1980s, was remarkable. The older generation's careers, in many cases, did gain some momentum in the slipstream created by the younger players' popularity, but nothing approaching that of the younger crowd. Many of these artists found that they could make a living, and sometimes a good one, teaching in the growing number of college and high school programs across the country. This was both salutary and problematic. To be employed as faculty in a college was to have one's hard-won reputation validated. In the case of named musicians, it also lent luster to the institution. All too often, though, these master musicians found themselves employed without tenure, and without the pay and with the benefits disparity that non-tenure implies. A sad commentary on the value accorded to artists in the academy. Happily, this situation is reversed somewhat, but is no means completely. A related effect of this generation entering the academy over the past 20 years or so has been the general attentiveness to bebop-derived style and repertory as stylistically comfortable to the instructor artist and as normative within the college or high school institution. This has been seen with alarm in some circles. David Ake and Ken Prouty have both lodged critiques of this development. And trumpeter and educator Mike Vax, in a report on the state of jazz education as of 1998, wrote, "The jazz idiom per se is not really taught in most high schools," and I would, later on he also joins that to comment on colleges. "The classes run much like a concert band rehearsal, where the teacher imparts knowledge by rote. The music is rehearsed over and over until most of the notes are right. The real concepts of jazz performance and feeling aren't addressed nearly enough. The main goal seems to be to learn the notes and not worry too much about the stylistic concept and improvisatory skills." By then, in 1998, the situation was uncomfortably similar to the portrayal of jazz education in the 1970s that I referred to earlier, when, as Ake reported, school big bands, sometimes called lab or stage bands, frequently defined the sole jazz outlet on campus. Ake also asserts that conditions had not changed much over time. He points to a study by ethnomusicologist Bruno Nettel, who wrote in the 1990s that the large jazz band, a miniature of the concert band, plays from scores a substantial amount of the music that may lack improvisation. This kind of big band jazz has a very modest role in the outside world of jazz, but the school nevertheless selects it to be the exemplar of jazz within its walls. Yet, in a more recent book, Ake either sees improvement or reassesses his earlier position as he points to nearly 150 internationally influential jazz musicians, all born since 1950, who are products of college jazz programs. I see at least two other positive signs. Neo-bop, as it's come to be known, has pulled into its orbit a receptive commercial and artistic space for fusion players who choose to reinvestigate post-bebop styles. Prominently, this includes both Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea. In my introduction, I pointed to the Grammy Award for a Jazz Performance by Chick Corea. Although most of his fans likely came to know him through his enormous success with the fusion band Return to Forever, this Grammy Award was for Friends, a return to the small group acoustic format. And Corea recorded a live dual piano album with Herbie Hancock that same year, which proclaimed that neither had divorced himself from the acoustic jazz idiom. The reissues market has also blessed both of these musicians, and they have moved comfortably from their multiple pasts, embracing elements of their earlier work without being confined by any of it. Also, and perhaps most prominently, the exchange of 50s and 60s era values between originators and inheritors has worked to the advantage of both. Certainly the public attention conferred to Art Blakey, for example, as a mentor and promoter of a host of young stars from Wayne Shorter through the Marcellus Brothers and beyond demonstrates this. As a result, a larger public enthusiastically bought new recordings by Blakey in the 1970s and 80s, while also plumbing his catalog as well. Reissues have had that effect on artists across the spectrum, not just jazz artists. A 1989 article on popular music reissues, while noting that 1 in 5 of all the pop LPs we now buy, this is in the UK, is a reissue of a catalog item, pointed out that whenever an established star releases a new album or goes out on tour, there will be a surge in demand for his early material. The effect, at least in pop music, was extreme, as of this 1989 article. Greatest hits compilations of old material do so much better than everything else, this article reported, that the British record industry has had to outlaw them from its main album chart to make use for new releases. And in the classical record business, CBS was reissuing back catalog recordings at a ferocious rate at the same time. One critic grumbled that some titles, in fact, seemed to be making their third or fourth appearance in the CD era under different logos and at different prices. But the most visible sign of change was in the startlingly fine and prolific output of the group of young lions that burst on the scene in the early 1980s, deeply versed, largely through reissues, in music that was recorded before they were born, who channeled the aesthetic direction and elements of post-bebop, now called in the press neo-bop, as well as a presentation style adapted from those earlier days. And here, I have to tell you about one of my favorite grad students at Cornell, recently graduated with a DMA in composition. I came across him stumbling into a rehearsal playing sort of a post-bebop style, and I couldn't believe how great he sounded. He was really using his horn timbrally. He was playing lots of swoops, lots of deuts, lots of flutters, and many, many different approaches to timbre, to sound. And I complimented him on it and immediately wanted to play with him. And I said, how is it that you sound so different from all these other guys that all they're doing is running changes? Everybody's playing scales, everybody's playing notes, and not worrying about sound, not worrying about the expressive. He said, well, actually, I grew up listening to Wynton Marsalis. So Wynton Marsalis, who had been channeling those very things, especially through his study of Louis Armstrong and other trumpeters in the early part of jazz history, was having a tremendous effect on this later guy. And this thing that made that interesting for me was I had just written an article very critical of Wynton Marsalis, and actually I had to really change my mind about a lot of what he was doing. Besides these small group improvisers, a number of tribute repertory bands embracing the orientation to big band charts decried by Nettle, all of these put new life in the jazz art and its reception in the marketplace through acts of homage, many of which won Grammy Awards. The Grammy Awards roster provides an interesting picture of these bows to earlier figures. Examples include Joe Henderson's 1993 award for his tribute to the 1950s music of the recently deceased Miles Davis. Also, vocalist Kurt Elling's 2009 cover of songs from the 1963 collaboration between John Coltrane and Johnny Hartman. And here I might also point to Ellington's vocalese cover of Coltrane's A Love Supreme, a bow both to Coltrane and to the style of vocalese associated with King Pleasure in the 1950s. And Arturo O'Farrell's homage to his father Chico. Other examples include May-December pairings, another way of both bowing to an earlier master and helping that master gain a new, younger audience, such as Bobby McFerrin's award-winning outing with Jon Hendricks in 1985, or Nicholas Payton's recording with Doc Cheatham in 1997. Repertory and ghost bands have also done well at the Grammys, including the Basie Band's collaboration with vocalist Diane Shure in 1987, and in a couple of interesting twists, a 1998 tribute to Ellington played by the Count Basie Band, and Miles Davis's end-of-life collaboration with Quincy Jones, essentially participating in a farewell tribute to himself. I don't believe it's coincidental that the Grammy selectors lavished the award on a preponderance of artists who had risen to prominence in the 1950s and 1960s until well past their 70th or their 80th birthday. And this is at a time when the pop categories were actively worshiping youth. Younger stars, those whose fame began in the 1970s or later, tended to win awards when they inflected their music toward post-bebop styles, even if they were otherwise known for their work in fusion, avant-garde, Latin, or other styles without a bebop-derived focus. So did the rise of the reissues market expand or close off recording and performance opportunities for young musicians, or indeed for older ones? Young musicians who came to prominence largely under the imprimatur of Wynton Marsalis, who collectively assumed values derived from post-bop, bebop, and earlier styles, and who adapted presentation styles from the 40s and 50s, found that they had an easier time gaining entry to venues such as Jazz at the Lincoln Center, and a growing concert hall and academic performance circuit. Jazz clubs sprang up or garnered renewed attention in urban areas, especially Manhattan and Brooklyn, but also in other major cities. Jazz labels favored the new but retrospective style. At the same time, fusion recording artists trended toward contemporary jazz, in quotes, with a few notable exceptions, such as Chick Corea's Electric Band, much of John McLaughlin's output, Mike Stern, and several others. But these were in the minority, and they tended not to be recognized with Grammy Awards. My sense, and I'm still gathering data on this, is that the reissues business closed some opportunities for new recording by jazz labels, at least during the CD reissues explosion. A review of Blue Note Records' current roster, for example, reveals about 80 artists, that's out of a total of 230, whose catalogs are primarily recent, meaning since 2000. Of course, there's a broad stylistic spectrum, including bebop, Afro-Caribbean, Brazilian, ambient, acid jazz, and others, but the preponderance clearly hews to neo-bop. And the reissues business continues to contribute a large portion of that label's income. One can easily relate to the attractiveness of repackaging and reissuing historical material in the vaults. And here, let me make clear that I'm talking across the jazz record industry, not about any particular label. Blessed with recording tape footage or metal master tapes, metal master plates of high musical quality, and not having to go to the trouble and cost of recording anew, even if you could find those earlier musicians and could imagine them still in their prime, the business model is obvious. This is the optimal situation, that the masters can be restored or even improved, that the musical interest is there, that period artwork can be found, or that the original artwork remains appropriate, that the artist representatives can come to terms, and that the publicity can be brought to bear on artists who already have a degree of name recognition. However, there can be a dark side to this move as well, when it is done by less than reputable houses. In 1998, I interviewed an independent record producer. At some point, I brought up the reissues phenomenon. I mentioned the savings in production costs. The producer answered, not only on production costs, but they pay the copyright percentage that was dictated in 1959.
Wow.
This is at a time when the percentage was 7.5 points. I asked, so those were not renegotiated? The answer came back, no, they refused. They say, hey, I've got a contract. You, meaning the musicians, say, wait a minute, that was recorded in 1959. In 1959, a record was $2.99 retail. You're now selling these CDs for $16. You're still paying a penny on the dollar? How dare you? It's 7 cents now. So the potential for abuse is real. Did the musical aesthetics these reissues presented reinforce an understanding of their original times, or did they replace their contexts with new ones? They so completely fit the Reagan-era politics and social nostalgia. Racialized discourses reflected civil rights movement-era images of dignity and uplift, certainly not Black Power antagonisms. Bourgeois aspirations, both in the commercial imaging of jazz and advertising, and in a widespread gentrification of jazz clubs. I might point to Yoshi's in Oakland, as well as Dizzy's and Iridium, the Blue Note, and others here in town. Stylized dress conventions of the 50s influenced fashion and hairstyles generally in the 1980s, proclaiming urbane sophistication, often with a saxophone or a trumpet as a prop, an image replicated on 1,000 jazz club stages. Beyond this, reissues became high-end consumer objects themselves. Mosaic's 18-disc Nat Cole set from 1990 with a list price of $270 sold 6,000 copies. And I pointed out elsewhere in another article that the CD reissues and coffee table book accompanying the multi-volume DVD set for the 2000 Ken Burns documentary Jazz was the equivalent of a house payment for over half the country at that time. Did the commitment to nostalgic approaches to jazz playing, focused on replicating the sounds, if not the improvisational impulses of their origins, have an effect on jazz pedagogy in the new Jazz Academy? And if so, was this positive or deleterious? Many observers have commented on this. David Ake, in his 2010 assessment of jazz education, says that lore has it that jazz thrives on real-time performances. He points to scholar John Gennari, who says, calls this the music's most fundamental and enduring article of faith, that is, real-time performance, even as certain recordings have become the genre's primary historical and pedagogical texts. Jeb Rasula expresses concern as well over the way that records as texts and objects seem to escape the scrutinizing gaze of the historian. I want to begin, Rasula writes, by noting the obvious pertinence of records not only as a research tool for the historian, but as a prominent factor in the lives of jazz musicians. Here is Harry Carney, Johnny Hodges' boyhood friend and later fellow member of the Ellington Band, saying, "I used to enjoy going to Johnny's house because he had a very good record collection, and we used to borrow ideas from records and copy them as much as we liked. Using records to improve your music making turns out to be the constant, if mongrel, accompaniment to jazz history from its beginnings." Rasula goes on to point out that Charlie Parker used to adjust the speed of his turntable so that he could adapt Lester Young's tenor solos to the pitch of his alto as he copied them note for note. To Rasula then, studying historical recordings, whether in the confines of a campus course or on their own, makes pedagogical sense. But Rasula cautions that a recording can have a militating effect on style, since it ceases becoming an improvisational process and, in his words, becomes scripture. Gabriel Solis agrees, saying that the interpenetration of past and present is fundamental to the power of musical experience. His study of the canonizing of Thelonious Monk studies contemporary jazz musicians' experiences of Monk as both listeners and performers, looking at the way their discussions of his performances and their own performances of his music express a way of integrating past and present in the music and in their lives. And have these effects been long-lasting and permanent, or have they changed? I've spent some time referring to Grammy Awards in jazz categories, and I've been studying the awards trends from the 1970s, actually from the year 1970, which is the year Billboard instituted a jazz albums chart, and seems a good beginning point. And I've been talking about reissues largely on CD, not exclusively though, and speculating about the relationships between these recordings and style and pedagogy. Our work on college pedagogy is just beginning, and I hope to have more to say about it in the future, especially after you guys school me. I've noticed that labels that mostly purvey CDs favor historical recordings. And I believe that their issuing CDs as opposed to other formats signifies an older and more settled demographic of folks who appreciate the essays, the photos, and other enhancements that a material object offers. But this is a trend, not a universal. Blue Note's catalog, for example, favors reissues and current releases of older established artists, but it also includes younger, up-and-coming artists on its roster, even if they tend to adhere stylistically to post-bebop aesthetics. But this is not to claim that jazz is backward-looking. I found it helpful to look at a cross-section of critical writings on best-of album lists published in the last few weeks. Not surprisingly, the place where stylistic innovation seems to be happening is in MP3-based and distributed jazz, either on small boutique labels or self-produced and self-distributed. A review of these best jazz albums of 2012 by a cross-section of authoritative critics from the New York Times, NPR, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, and others bears this out. So throughout this talk, and by the way, we talked a little bit in the dinner of some of the figures that are currently being talked about. Vijay Iyer for one, Kurt Elling for another, Ryan Truesdale, and others who are consistently on these best of charts, and they are distributed almost completely through the internet. Many of them are self-published, many of them are self-recorded, and completely bypassing the structure that I've been describing. Throughout this talk, I've collapsed, perhaps too glibly, a group of styles that emerged in the aftermath of the bebop groundswell, but that refer collectively to its personnel, stylistic elements, recording and performance conventions, and self-identification as post-bebop or post-bop, and its latter-day self-consciously referential style as neo-bop. The critics I've just surveyed all seem to have struggled to name the music of their best up lists that I've just been talking about under anything resembling a consistent rubric. I think that's one of the areas of both fascination and frustration for these emerging styles of music that nobody really has a clear and consistent name for. I conclude that there are two major trends in jazz recordings now. One decidedly nostalgic for the post-bop aesthetics of the 1950s and 60s, even if newly composed and recorded, and one that seems expansionary and incorporates some of the techniques and procedures of a variety of styles under the general heading of fusion or free jazz without really sounding like any of those styles. Currently, jazz programs, as revealed in a review of college websites and jazz education publications, suggest that the conservative approach still dominates. Although David Aick's recent appendix of young jazz stars who came through academic jazz programs points to significant, if still relatively isolated, counter-trends. It remains to be seen if these trends will be antagonistic to each other or will feed each other in a new round of revitalization for jazz. So stay tuned. Thanks.
Well, friends, I think you'll agree with me. There's a lot to think about in here. And one of the things Steve likes to do, which can be very unsettling, is to throw all this stuff out there, and now you're like, yeah, I hate I love reissue. I hate reissue. I love reissue. It's like you don't know what to think about it, because all of, it's like all of this is true, I just want to give one little historical note, and then can I assume that we've got some questions out there? Because there's so much jazz education, reissues. You approach it from whatever of these angles you want. He brought in a lot of stuff. Also, just the whole idea that the music business makes a difference. We don't like to think that, like, well, I just buy what I want to buy, and it doesn't make a difference what they put out. But what he's saying is maybe it makes a huge difference on everything from what you study in school to whether you get a gig or not. Maybe it makes more of a difference than you think. And I just want to mention historically, this is something Vince knows very well, that the idea of reissues goes back to the '78 era.
Yes.
And I mention that because a lot of people don't think that a '78 could have been a reissue. But as early as 1940 or whatever, they had the Hot Club of America, even before the late 30s. And they reissued, Louis Armstrong from the 20s, the Louis Armstrong Hot Five. And so the idea of reissue is older than you might think, because you think of reissue as a package, but an individual '78 could be a reissue, was in the olden days. And there was this Hot Club of America that was called, which was devoted to that. But the idea that reissues would be, from major labels, would be any kind of substantial part of their output is totally a new idea. That would have been bizarre to say. Hot Club of America was this little specialized thing, but to say RCA or Blue Note even, which is a big, at one point, independent label, or, Verve, whatever, would be largely devoted to reissues. Now, all of a sudden, now that's bizarre. You see, that's like a total change. So the history of reissues goes back a ways, but this kind of major thrust in reissues is a modern phenomenon, which is weird too. It's like in the classical music, they say the idea that you want to perform music, classical music, in a historically authentic way, as which Teruska likes to put it, is actually a modern idea. So everything is complicated.
Or even just the idea of doing an entire symphony, right?
Well, there you go. Okay.
Really began in the late 19th century, I guess, right?
Right.
And prior to that, you would have a pastiche of different movements and things like that that would constitute an evening's concert.
And in Beethoven's own day, I think 1825, he had a big concert by subscription, believe it or not. In other words, you had to buy a ticket in advance, which was kind of a novel idea already. And it was like 3-some hours, and it was, you know, a bit of this and a bit of that, and here's a movement from my violin concerto, and so forth and so on. So there's a lot to think about. Education, marketing, reissues. Raise your hands and let's get started.
Before we take that, let me just respond to one thing you said here.
Okay.
To underscore, I mentioned that I rewrote a lot of this, and one of the things that I pulled out was a long discussion about bebop and sort of conditions of bebop as described by Scott DeVoe.
Okay.
One of the things that I uncovered in that research, not by DeVoe, was an example of the light coming on about reissuing something. Frank Sinatra recorded, what was it, All the Things You Are, I think it was, in 1939, before the war and before the recording ban of 1942 and 3, and before the difficulty in finding shellac. It sold almost nothing. Right. And the way it was labeled was Artie, I think it was Artie Shaw.
It might have been
Harry James, excuse me.
Yeah,
Harry James. With vocal by
All or Nothing
Frank
at All,
Sinatra.
maybe.
All or Nothing at All. That's
Yeah.
exactly what it was. 1939. Then
It was a big hit. It was a hit.
It was a hit, but it was a minor hit.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah.
But
Let's see where he's going.
then you've got the recording band. You've got a series of all vocal recordings, 9 vocal recordings that Frank Sinatra puts out. Starts to really establish a name for himself. The recording band ends, and they reissue. Columbia, I think, whoever it was. Columbia did the vocal releases.
I think
remember.
James was a Columbia artist too.
Yeah. So anyway, the label reissues that same recording, but now it's changed the label, so it's Frank Sinatra,
Right.
accompanied by Harry James and orchestra. It becomes a #2 song.
Wow.
So that was a major sort of hello kind of moment, and yeah. So absolutely, I completely agree with what you're saying. And you know, the first jazz historians were essentially record collectors. It was kind of how that came about. Was those discussions between them.
Very interesting stuff. We've got about a half an hour for discussion. Let's start with Nick.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things you brought up are really interesting, especially like how reissues relate to education. And I was just wondering if you've ever really delved into how education now and maybe the young lions of the 80s that you talked about that are promoting this neo-bop style, how much that influences what is reissued. Because it seems like even nowadays you're more prone to find post-bop, 50s, 60s recordings than fusion material. Some fusion material can actually be hard to find in reissues.
Right, right. Yeah, although Mosaic is coming out with a new subsidiary label that's going to be focused more directly on fusion. But yeah, I think it's reciprocal. I think that one influences the other. In a way, that makes sense. I'm saying that intuitively. I can't tell you that because I've interviewed somebody who's told me this.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, sort of logical that there would be sort of a reinforcement cycle.
Yeah, because it seems like stuff like the jazz rock and the fusion isn't necessarily accepted by the Marsalis crowd, if that's what you want to call it, doesn't get the reissues like the stuff that Marsalis and the crowd would support.
Right, right.
They seem sort of,
There's maybe another element to that too, and that is that in the 50s, let's say in the late 40s through the mid 60s, during a period of huge explosion of independent record labels, there was a lot of motivation to record as often as you could. Charlie Parker recorded under how many different names and so on. Part of that was because, as I understand it, to have, and I think this is still true, I mean, if you have a record deal, or if you have a record catalog, you get to sell yourself much easier to a prospective band employer or prospective owner of a club than you do if you're just some schlub that comes off the street. So even if you were only getting something, as a one-off payment rather than something residual, it was still worth it in a way to record as much as you could. And those labels were finding that they could make a small profit on a very small amount of units sold. So, so there was a huge proliferation of recording that was going on. When you think about fusion, the investment cost of production is enormous compared to those things. So you could have a hit with 12,000 record sales in the old days, and you couldn't break even for less than 100,000 units sold. So just that's another part of that equation.
Yeah.
Interesting. Jonah, then Daniel, then Eric.
Have you ever, like, this may be alongside to this, but have you ever studied the influence of like something like YouTube and the ability to be able to search for a song by pretty much any song? You type it into YouTube and it'll come up, and the fact that people listen to music that way nowadays, a lot of people just go on YouTube and that's how I can find this, or I can find this, or this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little wistful about that because I grew up at a time when people were listening to albums, partly for the collection of music that was happening that might in those days be 20 minutes on a side. But there was in many cases, there was a sort of a thematic continuity, even if it was something that I applied to it, right? Just because I was used to hearing this song next to that song next to that song.
Yeah.
And I think that's missing. It's a little bit schizophrenic.
Yeah.
To quote Stephen Bell.
Oh, that is.
Yeah, right. But there's something a little disjointed about that. And I'm also one of these people that loves to read about all these people. I want to know, where they came from and what were the circumstances of recording all that stuff. So I'm a little wistful about that. You mentioned YouTube. There's also an app on my iPad called SoundHound. Do you know about that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. And a lot of hip-hop guys use that.
Tell them what it does, because not everyone knows.
It electronically listens to a piece of music and identifies it from an enormous data bank of essentially voice recognition technology.
The problem, Phil Schaap told me, the problem with that is that the CD that it'll tell you it comes from is most times a reissue. It tells you the wrong session, or it's part of a compilation. So when you're trying to find out what the original song is, it'll give you perhaps the exact information.
It's much more accurate with pop music.
I bet.
Yeah.
Well, Grace Note does that. Grace Note's been doing that for a while.
Yeah, Grace Note through
Because
the iTunes.
I've
uses that.
digitized LPs myself and then put it into iTunes. And Grace Note pops up and
Is that
says,
right?
this is what it is.
When you take it from the LP?
Yeah,
How
I
much-
was shocked.
Can you isolate? I mean, in other words, one of the things with SoundHound, people use it because they're looking for samples. Right? They're trying to identify samples within a song. And does it recognize quickly? I mean, does it need much of a sample in order to?
I don't know how it does it, but because you're not giving it the music. You make a CDR, you take an LP and you put it on a CDR, you stick it in your iTunes.
Yeah.
And
It's like it's a similar thing from the opposite angle.
the track names come up.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite angle. It's very
It could be doing it from the timings on the tracks and matching them up. I don't know. There's all kinds of ways it could be doing
weird.
it, but
Yeah, right.
it does it.
The SoundHound does it by listening.
Yeah,
to
you
the
see,
beginning of the
Grace
track.
Note doesn't listen.
It
They
doesn't
don't know.
listen.
Yeah.
Well, it might. I don't know. It
What do you
might
think
take
about
snippets. I don't
SoundHound?
know.
You can actually hum into the song that you've heard.
Yeah,
If the
recognize the
song
melody.
stopped playing, you can hum it in and it still recognizes it.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. It's
Now, Daniel, then Eric, other people too, I'm sure. I think Dustin had a hand up at one point, didn't you? No, but feel free. All right, Daniel, why don't you go next?
So I was
Trevor will get to you.
Feeling like there's sort of a section that might be missing concerning like radio, because I just
Yeah.
remember listening to Emerson radio when I was like 18, hearing an Archie Shepp live at Donnerschwegen, and I had to call him back and ask for it so I could tape it, so that I'd have a copy. And years later I found one,
Yeah.
but and also just over the last 15 years I've seen radio kind of at least that type of radio diminished to
Yeah.
formatted things and things that.
Yeah, I really agree with you that's something that's missing from this work and needs to show up in the printed version of this. There's a section in my book on Herbie Hancock that talks about freeform stereo as one of the major drivers of that style, right? Of that fusion explosion that happened. And Oldie's formatting as part of a top 40 AM system really started taking off in the late 1960s. You don't really think of it. I always think of it as having always been there. But I've done some research that's actually tries to pinpoint it to, I think, 1967. So I see that as something that is also influential on this, maybe sets some of that groundwork. And certainly jazz radio in particular has always, how many new things are you listening to on jazz radio? At least all the time I was listening to jazz radio in the Bay Area, it was always from the 50s and 60s. It was almost always big band. Very, when it was a small group, it was something that was still had to be 5 minutes or less or something like that. The idea of playing Bitches Brew, forget it.
Yeah. So what he's saying is free-form radio, which was a fairly new idea, and it doesn't have to be, we only play this. That allowed them to say, well, we're putting on Bitches Brew, or we're putting on
WKCR.
Yeah,
WKCR.
In my area, it was another station who also had a character named Captain Carrot, who would talk about holistic lifestyles. There would be spoken word things. There would be just really in complete control of the DJ. The DJ got paid nothing, so he could do whatever.
Right.
So the advent, the beginning of college, what we know as college radio.
Interesting. Eric, then Trevor.
First, thank you for a very informative and, as Dr. Porter mentioned, in the best sense of the word, provocative lecture.
Thank you.
Second, I am going to make the assumption by what you've said that you assume that jazz musicians are artists.
Yes.
Therefore comparable to other artists. And that brings to mind Picasso, who quickly realized that Cubism was not going to be a way to earn a living. And therefore found ways to make the most groundbreaking of art in other genres, essentially. So with that in mind, why should we, as jazz scholars or jazz musicians, as many of us are, be concerned with the impact of the music business on what is happening in jazz education or jazz as a whole?
Okay. I think my interest is not necessarily to evaluate it from a point of advocacy, so much as to point out, here's what I'm seeing, and here are the limitations or predilections that implies. Right? And for people who might not have thought of that, then it becomes a question of, well, do we want to have that confinement, let's say, that stylistic confinement, or do we want to do something that's more expensive? Are we aware that we are painting ourselves into a particular kind of box? Or is it something that we have been assuming is sort of normal or natural, or something? I think it takes a certain awareness for us to make some kind of aesthetic choice and programmatic choice.
Right.
Because don't forget that just like in college programs in general about anything, the assumption is that whatever you're studying probably will no longer exist as an employment opportunity, career path, by the time you're in your late 20s. Right? What we're trying to get people to do is figure out how to think critically, how to maneuver themselves in the real world, so that when they're presented with new situations, new opportunities, they can go.
So the answer would be to buy reissues and learn everything you can from them.
Yeah, right. What I'm saying is not necessarily, bad reissues. In fact, I'm absolutely not saying that. What I am saying is that for all the dollars that are invested in reissues, there are some dollars that are then not spent in other ways. But for us to not think about those cost-benefit equations, I think is a mistake.
Trevor, you had something, and then we'll see who else.
Yeah, I mean, the more I think about it, I originally had a question, but I just kept rolling over in my head when we were going to turn to this internal dialogue of mine, just thinking about how the whole idea of like the reissue seems to be playing, and the marketing behind the reissue seems to be playing on this like positive feedback loop of popularity at the time. So like you mentioned how when a new artist came up with something new, a lot of times the reissue would come out, and it makes me think of like, as a listener to the music, a lot of times when you hear something new for the first time, let's say, you're going to want to go back and find other stuff they did. And what's easier than looking and seeing, oh, there's a greatest hits album of this person, why not take a listen to it? And so I feel like that plays a big thing into it, as well as from the academic areas of like trying to formulate some kind of like jazz repertoire to teach, like what artists should we show here and why. I think that kind of plays into this as well, where there is this, again, feedback loop of trying to create almost a jazz canon. And I'm just curious, I just keep thinking to myself of how that ends or where it ends up in the future. Like, if, let's say, a particular jazz artist ceases to make the same music again, if a reissue is going to happen, and at what frequency would it happen down the road, if that makes any sense? Like,
what frequency the reissues would happen down
right.
the road? Like that's ultimately a business calculation, right? I mean, what you're trying to do is figure out, do I perceive that there is a market out there currently, or can I create one? And, you know, will I be able to sell those units? That has then implications for style, which I've been, rattling on about. I don't think there are very clear, direct lines in that. And all of those things become a matter of taste, a matter of calculation, a matter of scarcity of resources. I didn't talk too much about the oil crisis, but the oil crisis, just like conditions in the 40s that helped to create the environment in which bebop arose, right? Those things also have their impact on the fortunes of music production and distribution.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too, like the ease of access and like how visible are these, I guess, jazz brands, whatever, to the general population of like. How easy it is to find this sort of stuff. Like you can stumble upon it by accident versus having to go out on your own volition and find a particular niche.
That's really interesting. I think there's this really funny dynamic, and I don't know that anybody in marketing has tried to work this out or is even aware of it. But I really feel that jazz fans in particular, just like maybe metalheads and punk fans, really get off on finding the obscure, right? And the minute too many people like it, it's no longer hit. You know what I mean? So in a way, why would the marketers deprive you of the joy of ferreting out that obscure, artist or something? That I have no really good answer for you there, but it is a really interesting.
Yeah, it's just things I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Okay. Who's ready?
I just raised my hand, so.
That's good. That's good. I'm glad you did. Alex, David, Steve, and then we'll come back to Daniel.
Just a thought, is there a way of, or was there any interest in charting the demographic of who is really the buyer of the reissue for the sake of, is it nostalgia driven or institutionalization driven?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have a bias, and my bias is to assume that that the characterization of a particular customer, like is somebody a customer for fusion, or somebody a customer for soul, or somebody a funk customer, or somebody's a hip hop. I don't think that exists. I think, I don't know about you, but I listen to a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And invariably, at the beginning of the semester, when I ask my students, what's your favorite music? Everybody says, I like all kinds of things. You know, I don't want to be painted in a box. They might say a couple of things they hate. But they very rarely say, I only listen to this one thing.
But I would say that the characterization or self-characterization of what actually ends up being the reality at the end of the day is like, I don't, you know, I say I do a lot of music, but I'm not going to put Taylor Swift on probably ever.
That's the hate part. Yeah.
But the thing is that people say I listen to everything, and I taught a general music class, but I would doubt very much that more than 5% had kind of blue of people who are in the under 25 category. So to say, I think that while we want to sort of look at the more universal or, you know, eclectic buyer, I'd say that there still is a different niches, and I think that it's, in our little corner of the musical world, I think it is sort of the two big groups I see are the student and the person who grew up listening to it as being the two demographics that mostly, I mean, who consist in this room, you know. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems I face as a teacher, you know, and I teach a jazz history course as well as some other courses, but I'm faced with the conundrum of, well, that you expressed in your book, you know, looking for the, you know, do you balance the thing that is appeals to your sense of taste, or do you look for the thing that is historically significant? And what does historically significant mean? Right? It's always a juggling. So I think that I'm not afraid of this niche problem, and I'm not afraid of the eclecticism. In fact, I think that's a major quality of people who involve themselves in jazz. I think that we tend to have strong likes and dislikes, but we also like to see ourselves as archaeologists. And but part of it has to do with the opportunity to be exposed to things, and that's part of where reissues come in. And one thing I want to just mention is, and this is confessional, I grew up playing surf music to begin with, and only then progressed to the Beatles and Rolling Stones in 1964. So that my exposure to music in jazz was very late, very late. And my appreciation of Herbie Hancock stemmed from my engagement with fusion, because I was a drummer and I liked to play a lot of notes. So when I heard VSOP at the Greek Theater in Berkeley, I thought I was going to hear Headhunter. I had no idea that this guy had done all this stuff. And it wasn't until after I went, oh my God, that I started, you know, figuring out who this guy really was and who Miles Davis was really all about. It took that. So part of this has to do with recontextualizing, reframing. Sometimes it is new but retrospective playing. Sometimes it is reissues. Sometimes it's something else. But I think that all these things go into this soup.
And just to make sure everybody knows, the VSOP tours that Herbie started to do, I think it was 75, maybe was the first one, the idea of VSOP in liquor is like something, you know, very special old pal, it stands for. But the idea was, you know, that fine old stuff that Herbie used to do. It was about 10 years before. Right. They were treating it like it was thousands of years. This is what they used to do back before Leonardo da Vinci, you know. It was like 10 years before, but it was like Maiden Voyage and stuff like that. And it was the Blue Note era, basically.
Yeah. So what happened was the
acoustic jazz.
Acoustic jazz. It was 76, and it was for the Newport Jazz Festival. George Wein invited Herbie, but Herbie didn't need the gig because he was riding high with Headhunters and Thrust.
Mm.
So his manager said, "Well, I tell you what, I don't want to be, you know, I don't want you to take the gig because we have other stuff to do. But so what I'll do is I'll come back to him with an offer he can't possibly accept, and we'll be off the hook." So he went back to Wien, said, "Okay, Herbie is glad to play for the festival if he plays the closing night and if the night is devoted to a retrospective of his music," which had never happened with any other artist. It hadn't happened with Miles Davis. So they figured we're in the clear. Wien bought it. So the final night of the thing was a concert that started with the Mwandishi group, and then did, sorry, it's the opposite. They did VSOP, which was the Miles Davis Quintet with Freddie Hubbard in the Miles Davis chair. Then did the Mwandishi avant-garde group, the electronic group, and then closed the night with what everybody essentially wanted to hear. But the audience went crazy for that first group. So they put together a tour, called themselves VSOP.
Very cool. And that manager, I think, was the same Mr. Rubinson that gave you a hard time over your article.
He was.
Right?
He was.
So that's an interesting connection. David, then Steve, then Daniel, then Jason. All right, we'll see. We're having a good discussion. Let's go a little bit longer. I don't want to keep people too late, but let's see. David, you're next.
I just wanted to ask you about this neobop term that you're using. So you're implying that they're pulling musical aesthetics from, I guess, a combination of what they're learning at school, the reissued recordings, and what they've learned from actually direct contact with people from an earlier time. I guess
Notably from Mark Blakey.
Right. So can you describe, like, I guess, some of the musical aesthetics you're talking about, and where that's coming from?
Yeah. Part of that is it's a catch-all phrase. In some ways, it was a jazz press phrase, or maybe not even, maybe a popular press phrase.
Yeah, you mentioned it.
That went into sort of general circulation, and the reason that's more appropriate than one of the styles is usually bandied about in terms of style developments in the aftermath of the bebop explosion, is that it's not particularly hard bop, it's not particularly cool jazz, it's not, it uses some of the techniques of modalism, but it's not modal. But it is very reminiscent of all of those, right? And most importantly, it's eschewing the idea of electronics. Right? That was the elephant in the room. Right? So you can call it whatever you want, but what it isn't is the important stuff. It's an anti-fusion. I have a particular attraction to away from using those more parsed terms in connection with the 50s and 60s, and the reason for that is that often, and this is my bias now, often those things are described in largely harmonic terms, and I think that the things that become really interesting in those 2 decades are certainly harmonic changes, approaches to melody, approaches to form, but I think centrally sound. I think that timbre became front and center and became something that became a marker not only of sort of general trends, but also individual trends. Also, there's too many people playing in each other's groups to say that these are hard bop folks and these are cool folks. So I don't have a tremendous. I mean, the 2 options are to either lump it all together and not worry about it, or to get very specific, which I think is too much trouble. So I'm choosing to go with the lumping. Is that okay? Yeah. But I recognize that that's a risk, and I almost said something at the beginning.
Steve.
You spoke to this point to some extent already in your discussion of Kind of Blue, but what I'm wondering is, to what extent it can be said that historical reissues, particularly the concept of a definitive reissue, which seems to go so hand in hand with the technology to allow for those reissues to take place, in a sense competes with the album as originally issued itself.
Yes.
I'll give you an example. In terms of chronology, when you look at Coltrane's output, as it's reissued through Fantasy, when Fantasy was before they merged with Concord, and then also Atlantic, what tends to be featured in the liner notes, or just in terms of start with back, is when the album was recorded, or the session recording date, rather than when it was reissued, or issued originally, I should say. So for example, something like Culture and Sound, which was issued in '64, we will think of it as a recording from 1960. And looking at it in retrospect, the idea would be, well, that must have had a huge impact in 1960. Well, people weren't listening to it, the record didn't come out yet. So I'm wondering to what extent it can be said that reissues or the concept of these extensive reissue programs are really having a potentially detrimental, or at least historically inaccurate, impact on us in terms of, or on listeners in general, when it comes to when these recordings were actually issued. Really.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement. You're right. There is always going to be a distortion. Not only in terms of that notion of historical, tweaking and inaccuracy, but there's inherent distortion in the idea of taking a captured moment on tape and playing it as if it's unfolding for the 15th time that you've heard it. Right? I interviewed Bob James one time, and he was complaining about the people taking him to task for not being a fabulous improviser. He said, playing improvised music is taking a risk. You're walking off a cliff and hoping you land okay. And if people think I'm too conservative, I would be okay if I would be very happy to just play something and go nuts, right? Which he did in his first album. If everybody would agree.
A lot of people don't know. He
Yes.
made his name as like the avant-garde piano trio of college students. Wild stuff. You ever hear any of that? Including playing tape collages while the trio improvises. Not at all what you think of as Bob James.
Is that called like Explosions?
Explosions was one of his
Yeah,
first
it
two
has like
albums.
a face,
Yeah.
like it's
Yep.
like a shadowy face.
Very good. Yes, Explosions, and there was one other. These were his avant-gardes, and then he did like Bach arranged for synthesizer.
Yeah.
That was, from then on, that was it.
Yeah, right.
But go ahead. With your
Well, anyway, he said if people would agree to only listen to it once, then we could share that immediacy, and it would be okay. But people won't. They'll go back and refer to it with an ever more critical ear.
Wow.
And so my responsibilities are to not go more adventurous, but more conservative.
Wow.
So anyway, I guess I'm saying that the experience of distortion is, I think, inherent. And in a way, it's a fiction that we bring to the listening act to say that we are figuratively in the room, in Rudy Van Gelder's parents' living room. We're not. And with each successive reissue, part of the remastering art is to take into account what's changed in terms of playback. So the response range, right, is very different. And in fact, hip hop's a great example of this. Most hip hop now, of course, is like all at the bass, right? But it's not all at the bass, because you must have something very, very high to give you a focal point to draw the comparison between the two. And recording in 1960s, the whole thing was synced in the middle. Drum tuning's a great example of how to figure that out. So there is inherent distortion, and maybe that's something for us to recognize and understand. But I'm not sure that it can be. I'm not sure what the cure is. And maybe it can be cured. And I don't know what that cure would be.
Very interesting stuff. Now, we're just going to take about another 5 minutes. And just one thing I want to mention kind of ties in a little with what Steve said, and I think maybe just reinforcing something you said, but that the way the reissues are packaged and marketed not only makes them very appealing, but makes you feel that it's a better use of your limited budget. You say, well, look, I got the complete blankety blank with added tracks that it never had before. Yeah. Instead of getting Dave Douglas's latest album, which, all right, some other time I can always get that. You know what I mean? Now, once in a blue moon, you do see somebody like Dave Douglas who put something out, I think it's called The Complete Greenleaf Sessions. And you look at it and you're going, I never even heard of the Greenleaf Sessions, but if it's complete, there must be some reason why. It's like using the same marketing idea, but on something that's new.
Yeah.
It's like, well, if it's complete, there's got to be some reason why I'm supposed to have the complete, because there's like, it must be famous.
Yeah.
Why would you say the complete Greenleaf? Unless everyone's going, of course, the Greenleaf Session, why would you know. So it's the whole, now people are using that kind of marketing. This is a little bit of a sad note because she recently died, but there was a young singer named Jill Cyphers. Probably nobody ever even heard of. She was a Manhattan School of Music student. And I noticed that there's an album, The Complete Jill Cyphers, somebody else who I never heard of. I didn't know her because she was in my class when I used to teach at Manhattan School. But you know, Jill Cyphers, somebody else sessions. And two people that probably nobody has ever heard of, but marketed in such a way you're like, well, it's the Complete Sessions that... I don't know why. Why did I never hear that before?
That's because men collect that way.
Well, that's true.
That's true. There was an interesting article because men want to have like complete every, you know, in this.
Exactly.
And then Victoria's Secret put out these CDs that were compilations, and they sold through the roof to women. And they were doing studies, and they were showing it because the women just want to have good music.
Oh yeah,
and the
doesn't have to
men
be.
are the ones that gotta get, oh, this lost track that nobody had.
Exactly.
And collectors in general are just that way. You know?
Exactly.
If you tell them it's the complete, they're gonna buy it even if they don't like it.
They don't even know what it is.
Because they got it all.
So I'm curious, does that mean that geek is a masculine noun?
Yes.
So yeah, more likely. And nerd is too, I think. But while we're at it, what would be your accessibility if some of the people who don't get to speak right now want to follow up with you by email?
Sure.
Would that be something you'd be cool with?
Yeah, yeah.
Could I give them the SF8 Cornell one?
Yeah, here, I can give it to you right now. It's
Okay.
SFP8, my initials, at cornell.edu.
Easy? You got it? Stephen F. Pond, 8, number 8. At cornell.edu. So feel free, because I don't like to keep people too long, but I knew this was going to be a good one to talk about. We don't usually have such a long discussion. That's a very good sign. Who are the people who still have things that they want to say? Go ahead. Christian is one. Who else was it? Well, I did promise we were going to get back to Daniel, Jason, and then let's hear from, let me see the rest. Let's try everybody, but then whoever doesn't have your hand up now, you'll be the ones who follow up by email. How's that? So I think Daniel's next in line, and then Jason.
This kind of ties in really well, but someone had told me about a documentary about collectors, and that there's literally like a chemical reaction when you find
that makes sense
in the brain, and I from my own guinea pigness, it's definitely true.
But
you know what I've never really collected very well is money.
We got to work on that one. There were paid. There's such thing as coin collectors. Don't forget. Just two quick things about that I have to say. Which is one is that documentary is online somewhere. My friend Cream Gabbard loves it. He's like, oh, I got to write about this. But which because you're ready to kill him because of that. Because they go crazy. He's so academic. You know. But I think it's on that Vimeo, one of those. But you can't find it. And but the other thing I want to mention is I don't really collect anymore the way I used to, but I certainly am a collector. If you've been to my place, you know, I have an immense collection about the size of this room. I'm talking about a very large private collection. And, I mean, of the walls of this room, not the middle of them, you can still walk. But I actually used to have this problem, seriously. I'd be in a shop looking over where LPs, let's say before the CD era, and I'd get really excited. Oh, wait a second. And then go, wait. Am I excited because I've always been looking for this one and I don't have it? Or am I remembering what it felt like the last time I found it and bought it? And I couldn't remember whether I had bought it or whether I was still looking for it.
Or even how many times you bought it.
How many times I was just so excited. I said, I can't remember why I'm excited about this. And I couldn't figure out, should I buy this or not? All right, true story. All right, you see sweet guys again, and yeah, I remember that. Jason.
This kind of goes back to Alex's question about the demographic of the reissue market. Has your I'm an intern at the Blue Note, and I know that our clientele a lot of times, and trust me, I've had to do way too much research on this than I wanted to. But a lot of our demographic is actually, you would think it would be a lot of local New York City area people, but honestly, most of our clientele is from Japan, Europe, namely Germany, Italy.
Tourists.
That come to New York specifically to hear American jazz.
Right.
Absolutely.
So I just wonder how much of a market, I guess, is the reissue business played in the marketing of jazz in foreign markets.
I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that Japan in particular, I mean, since you mentioned Japan, is a very active jazz scene, right? And the appetite for American jazz in particular, but jazz sort of generally is huge. One thing that strikes me, and this maybe goes back to an earlier comment, is I think that one of the reasons that tourists might want to go to a place like Blue Note, which is internationally famous, and it's a historical, of historical import itself, is that it connects with this whole reissue thing, which is that many of us want some voice of authority telling us what to care about. What's the important stuff? And if I go to the Blue Note, that's in effect somebody telling me you should be caring about this. Whoever you saw that night, and it doesn't matter who you saw,
right,
because all the people that go there are important musicians. I think there's something to that.
Mm.
And whether that means that New Yorkers are more jaded because they're more exposed, I don't think it's necessarily that particularly. But I experience that in Ithaca. We have a monthly event that we instituted this year called Jazz Spaces Ithaca that we have a very hard time generating a big audience for anything. But once a month we have somebody who's sort of nibbling at the important spots in Manhattan and Brooklyn, often paired with somebody local, because we have a very active music scene in Ithaca. And those places are packed. But if we did it twice a month, I'm not sure they would be. But one thing that happens is by us saying, okay, Jazz Spaces Ithaca, first Thursday night of the month, everybody knows that whoever is going to be there is somebody that they should know about. Even if they don't know about it, they should now know about it.
Could you name just one example?
Mark Johnson. VJR.
Mark Johnson, the bassist.
Yeah.
VJI, okay.
VJR will be here this month, this semester. Actually, Jason Moran and his wife will be there.
His wife's
they've come, Alicia, was it Alicia Hall?
Something like that. Sounds right, something.
Yeah. So anyway, right at that sort of borderline, and that becomes an educational moment.
Right. Christian?
I'm sure I keep it brief. I guess jumping off of what Steve Beck was saying about reissues. The thing about reissues is that a lot of stuff doesn't get reissued, and that there's this historical sort of delete. That unless you're chilling in the IJS, you really don't have to look very far to find something that has not been reissued. And it's easy to forget that it's not the business of a record company to be a historical entity. It's not, I mean, in some ways it is because of the clientele that they're trying to sell to, but it's not their job to preserve history. They're trying to make a profit. And I think that's where the nonprofit and the sort of academic study of the music is where it's really important that these things be preserved.
I completely agree with you, and I think I might nuance that in one small way, and that is that even some people who are in the business world of jazz are very mindful that jazz itself is a very small and constantly under threat form from a commercial standpoint, and so they see themselves as curators. Or in Keep News is one. Michael Kuskuna, right? Dan, just lot of people who are in an entrepreneurial position, but see themselves in a dual role of being a curator as well. And another one of the things that they must grapple with is how usable is the material, right? I mean, just physically, are the tapes in good enough shape that we can make use of these things? Or are they just like, in many cases, they're just like thrown in some basement someplace, and you got to like root through them and figure out what the box even contains. And I think that I don't mean to. I probably have implied that this is a sort of a self-serving, cutthroaty, kind of thing. I think it's natural to commodify something you believe in, just as well as it's something that you are completely cynical about. And you might try to do it and do well by doing good, But what you're saying is also true, that there are plenty of reasons why somebody might want to say, well, nobody's going to buy, I mean, maybe Bunny Berrigan was an obvious one to somebody, but it wouldn't have been obvious to me, to do the complete works of Bunny Berrigan and do it as a box set. But there's a market that can be generated. Then you go and service that market.
And I just want to throw in I know for a fact that Michael is doing it as mixed projects because he knows they're not going to sell.
Yeah.
No, he's not going to put everything out.
Sure.
One of my projects.
Oops. I've sometimes proposed things to Michael that he just said that the sound quality is not good enough. He has his own standards for sound or whatever.
But usually you know there's no market for some of those things that we want to see. We want to see them because we like those particular artists.
Exactly.
They're very limited.
But I think one of the things that I was hearing in your comment, your question, was that one of the functions of something like this institution here is that it's not bound, by those considerations. You're in the business of collecting and disseminating things because they have artistic and historical worth, cultural worth, and that is a sort of a higher call. I think that Cornell has some archival interests that are parallel to that. We have an immense hip-hop collection.
Is that
the largest in the country?
No way.
We also have what will very soon be the largest American punk collection.
Wow.
So we have some...
By the way, the two canceled each other out.
Yeah.
Seriously, they thought they had this huge collection, and it just kind of became zero. It's like, where did it go?
But our whole purpose is really two things. Two things. One is 500 years from now, when we are letting people see our Gutenberg Bible and our copy of the Gettysburg Address.
They have these.
Which we have. Right next to that, we'll have materials from the hip-hop collection. And
interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing is dissemination. We want people to know about this stuff. So now what we're trying to do is find ways, like you guys are, to disseminate things as widely as possible while still respecting copyright constraints.
I'm going to let Karen ask the last question tonight. I'm going to say...
I don't really have a question. I had
really?
a comment, so if someone else wants to take it, they
Well,
can.
you're still the last, so it's up to you. And I'm going to say that to everybody, you've got his email address. Hey, you don't have to respond, you know what I'm saying? No, but honestly though, Steve's like me, he will respond if you're right, depending on the time.
Nobody's as fast as him.
I'm pretty good. I'm not as fast as I used to be. What's that?
SFP 8 at Cornell.
SFP and then the number 8 at Cornell.edu. But he's good. I mean, Steve is busy. If he only has time for a short response, you'll get that, but you'll get something, And Karen, what did you want to tell us? Something? Or is that something to
I had
share by
two
email?
little comments. One was, I was in the Goodwill store the other day, and there was a young lady in her 20s was looking at this big console that had an old record player in it, and she was really interested in it, and I must have made a comment, oh, I collect records, She said, no, this is for my band. A lot of the new bands now are putting their material out on vinyl.
Oh, that's
again.
true. Yeah, that's
I'm
interesting.
pretty sure she wasn't a jazz artist. And is your Herbie Hancock book coming out soon?
Oh, it's
that's out.
It's out.
Oh, it's
been
already
out a
out.
few years.
What's the name of it?
It's,
Oh, it's right
it's that,
there.
yeah.
Headhunters, the making of, what is this? What's the subtitle?
Jazz's first platinum
I just thought it was an
Jazz's
interesting,
first platinum
when I
album.
was in high school in the 70s, I took a modern dance class, and we actually danced to, not to Chameleon, to Watermelon Man.
Oh, yeah.
In our dance
That
class.
arrangement.
That arrangement,
Yeah.
that was this music we used for dance class, Columbia High School, 1974 or 5.
I can only tell you that I'm older than you.
Ah.
You were dancing to other stuff.
Well, friends, don't you think we had a fascinating guest tonight?